Okay, tonight we're stepping into the neon-lit streets of San Francisco, where shadows linger longer than the city's iconic skyline. Imagine walking alone past flickering streetlights, the hum of nightlife masking an invisible, persistent danger. Tonight, we revisit a cold case that continues to haunt memory, a story of silence, fear, and an unsolved mystery that marks the city's dark past. Welcome to Criminal Mindcast, where true crime is told through silence and the weight of the unsaid. We explore the spaces between moments, the psychology behind actions, and the hidden threads connecting people to their darkest impulses, illuminating shadows where truth quietly waits. Today, we examine the case of the Doodler, a predator who targeted young men in the 1970s, leaving sketches as chilling signatures. His victims lived at the margins, where seeking connection carried immense risk, even death. In the early 1970s, San Francisco's Castro district pulsed with life and identity. Yet beneath its rainbow veneer lay fear and invisibility. The victims were young men navigating a world that required them to hide fundamental parts of themselves. Many sought solace in bars and private clubs, places that offered both liberation and the risk of encounter with predators. Their lives, ordinary in appearance, carried the weight of secrecy, internalized shame, and constant vigilance. The suspected killer, known only as the Doodler, presented himself as a charming enigma. He carried a small sketchbook, a tool that allowed him to observe, to manipulate, and to communicate in silence. Each drawing captured more than a likeness. It encoded his fascination, his judgment, and perhaps the cold detachment necessary to take a life. This duality, a public mask of civility and a hidden appetite for control, forms the core of his psychological profile. Family histories, though often obscured and incomplete, reveal subtle but meaningful patterns that may have shaped the psychological landscape of the perpetrator. Early environments characterized by neglect, emotional distance, or rigid expectations frequently appear in the backgrounds of serial offenders, providing fertile ground for the development of maladaptive coping mechanisms. Trauma experienced in formative years can foster a profound sense of alienation, mistrust, and the need to assert control in ways that are both covert and calculated. In many cases, this manifests as a compulsive observation of others, a method of understanding and dominating the world from a safe distance without exposing oneself to vulnerability. For the Doodler, the sketchbook functioned as more than a mere artistic tool. It became a psychological instrument, a means of both studying and containing his victims, a symbolic extension of his inner world where detachment and control coexisted. In this sense, the notebook was simultaneously a shield, preserving the boundaries of his hidden identity, and a weapon, facilitating premeditated acts that bridged imagination and reality. Victims' narratives reveal patterns of behavior common to vulnerable populations in marginalized communities. They pursued relationships, companionship, and fleeting moments of trust, navigating the liminal spaces between visibility and concealment. These dynamics created conditions in which predation could occur without immediate detection. The intersection of societal stigma, personal secrecy, and urban anonymity allowed a predator to operate with relative impunity. Psychological profiling indicates that the Doodler likely operated with a remarkable degree of organization, demonstrating meticulous planning and a heightened awareness of risk in each interaction. Offenders of this type typically maintain a compartmentalized identity, separating their public persona from their private violent impulses, which allows them to navigate social spaces without raising immediate suspicion. Such individuals often exhibit obsessive tendencies, carefully observing potential victims, analyzing behaviors, and selecting targets based on subtle cues that indicate vulnerability or compliance. Their interactions are rarely impulsive. Instead, they are structured to maximize control and minimize exposure. Interpersonal deficits may coexist with superficial charm, enabling the perpetrator to elicit trust and cooperation while simultaneously manipulating perception. In the Doodler's case, this combination of calculated social engagement and concealed aggression reveals a sophisticated psychological mechanism. Violence is executed not only through physical action, but through the deliberate orchestration of social dynamics, exploiting perception, trust, and the unseen gaps between human awareness and intention. The victims' lives, though tragically short, were marked by resilience and attempts to construct meaningful connections. Their choices, influenced by a hostile social environment, highlight how societal pressures intersect with individual vulnerability. Each encounter with the Doodler, framed as an innocuous social meeting, became a junction where trust and danger converged inescapably. San Francisco itself, a city known for liberation and counterculture, becomes a character in this narrative. Its nightlife, intimate clubs, and winding streets offered both refuge and risk. The urban landscape, combined with societal marginalization, shaped interactions in ways that facilitated the predator's agenda. The tension between community cohesion and hidden menace forms a backdrop for understanding both victims and suspect. The Doodler's methodology demonstrates characteristics consistent with organized offenders. Crime scene evidence, limited though it was, suggested deliberate planning, victim selection, and post-offense caution. Such individuals often maintain social functionality while engaging in clandestine acts of violence, making them difficult to apprehend. His pattern of approaching victims with charm, sketching them, and then enacting violence exemplifies a structured psychological process rooted in observation and control rather than impulsive aggression. Community dynamics further complicated detection. The LGBT community, already wary of law enforcement due to discrimination, often hesitated to report suspicious encounters. Victims' disappearances were interpreted cautiously, their absence blending into broader social invisibility. This social reality compounded investigative challenges, while also amplifying the psychological terror that permeated daily life. The combination of predator sophistication, victim vulnerability, and systemic neglect created a scenario in which terror could thrive unnoticed. Each victim's story reflects both individual circumstance and structural marginalization, highlighting how complex human and social factors intertwine in cases of serial predation. Understanding these layers is essential to comprehending both the scope and nature of the Doodler's crimes. Historical context casts light on the broader dimensions of these crimes. In 1970s San Francisco, the LGBT community faced legal, social, and cultural pressures that heightened vulnerability to predation. Fear of exposure limited communication, constrained behavior, and intensified psychological stress. These conditions created an environment where victims were both visible and invisible, and where predators could exploit societal stigma. Understanding this interplay between marginalization and individual vulnerability is essential for interpreting the behaviors of both victims and the offender. The Doodler case reveals a profound duality between visibility and invisibility, where victims sought connection, presence, and acceptance within a society that marginalized them, while the predator remained an unseen observer, meticulously navigating the same spaces. This constant tension, the interplay between trust and concealment, exposure and caution, shaped every encounter, influencing decisions, reactions, and ultimately the trajectory of events. Social and psychological currents converged, amplifying vulnerability while enabling predation. The predator's methodical detachment contrasted sharply with the victim's desire for recognition, highlighting the subtle yet powerful mechanisms through which danger can operate in plain sight. Within this shadowed dynamic, the Doodler's story unfolds as a chilling reflection on human fragility, the exploitation of social trust, and the complexity of concealed, deliberate violence. Encounters with the Doodler often began with remarkable subtlety, unfolding through ordinary gestures, brief exchanges, and casual introductions in spaces that blended social exposure with relative privacy. Nightclubs, dimly lit bars, and private apartments became arenas where anonymity offered both freedom and risk, allowing the predator to navigate without immediate detection. His modus operandi, deceptively simple on the surface, involved careful observation, deliberate engagement, and the ritualized act of sketching. Each drawing, small enough to fit into a portable notebook yet precise in detail, captured more than physical appearance. It recorded posture, micro-expressions, and subtle emotional nuances. These sketches functioned as psychological rehearsals, enabling him to anticipate reactions, gauge compliance, and mentally map the path to control. In each stroke, preferences, judgments, and latent aggression were encoded, offering a window into a mind at once detached, methodical, and calculating. Victims were last seen under circumstances shaped by both the era's social realities and the offender's strategy. Flickering club lights, narrow alleys, and secluded apartments created conditions where oversight was minimal and fear of exposure limited vigilance. Initial interactions appeared mundane, yet subtle cues. Hesitation, fleeting glances, or willingness to accompany the predator foreshadowed danger. Law enforcement noted these anomalies, but fragmented observations and a lack of analytical frameworks left the emerging pattern obscured, allowing the Doodler's predation to continue undetected. The first reported murder involved a young man known for his sociability and frequent presence in the city's nightlife. He was approached after leaving a bar, drawn into a private space under the assumption of safety and privacy, only to vanish hours later. The delayed discovery of his absence prompted concern, but investigative reach was constrained by a complex mix of societal marginalization, distrust of authorities, and procedural limitations. The killer's careful orchestration exploited social norms, environmental structure, and gaps in procedural oversight. By blending into the very spaces where his victims sought visibility, he maintained a duality of presence and invisibility that rendered detection nearly impossible. Subsequent victims followed trajectories that were disturbingly consistent, yet each encounter contained subtle variations, reflecting the predator's adaptability, acute observation, and situational awareness. He approached targets with a blend of charm and curiosity, often requesting sketches in a manner that seemed innocuous, even flattering. These sessions were more than casual interactions. They were instruments of psychological evaluation, establishing rapport, gauging reactions, and asserting a subtle dominance. The Doodler's method embodies the hallmarks of an organized serial offender: deliberate engagement, meticulous risk assessment, and the strategic use of psychological manipulation preceding any act of violence. His aggression was never impulsive. It was a controlled extension of observation and premeditation, executed only after careful assessment of opportunity and potential consequences. Analysis of investigative notes indicates that the timeline of offenses spanned multiple years, with intervals reflecting both deliberate restraint and circumstantial opportunity. Offenses often coincided with social gatherings and nightlife activity when the community's attention was dispersed. Urban geography, narrow alleys, hidden apartments, and densely trafficked streets facilitated mobility while providing concealment. The predator's spacing and timing demonstrate an acute awareness of both environmental conditions and human behavior, maximizing control while minimizing risk. Physical evidence was sparse and largely anecdotal. Victim descriptions, fragmented sketches, and eyewitness observations formed the bulk of investigative material. Forensic markers at the time were minimal, delaying recognition of consistent patterns and hampering law enforcement analysis. Despite this scarcity, behavioral consistency in victim selection, encounter method, and pre-offense engagement supports a profile of deliberate organization. The Doodler was not driven solely by opportunity or impulse. Rather, he operated within a rigid cognitive framework, where each interaction was both an evaluation and a performance, structured to maintain authority over both circumstance and perception. Each murder carried symbolic resonance beyond the immediate act of violence. The pre-offense sketching suggests ritualized cognition, a separation of observation and execution that allowed psychological distance from the consequences of action. The notebook functioned simultaneously as a protective tool, preserving the offender's private identity, and as a trophy, immortalizing encounters and reinforcing control. Through this dual function, creativity and predation intertwined, illustrating a complex psychological architecture where art, observation, and lethal intent coexisted. The act of drawing, rather than being incidental, becomes central to understanding the offender's psyche. It is both a rehearsal and a mechanism for exerting dominance from a safe emotional distance. Behavioral anomalies observed during victims' final interactions with the Doodler often went unnoticed at the time. Slight hesitations, subtle evasions, or brief expressions of discomfort signaled psychological manipulation, yet contemporaries rarely recognized these as warning signs. Retrospective analysis frames such interactions as deliberate components of a calculated strategy, illustrating how cognitive leverage can replace physical force as a primary tool of control. The Doodler's method emphasizes premeditated manipulation, where violence emerges as an extension of careful observation, measured assessment, and strategic control over both environment and perception. Chronological reconstruction of the offenses highlights remarkable spatial and temporal consistency. Disappearances concentrated around nightlife venues, private apartments, and transient urban spaces with minimal social monitoring. The city's densely packed streets, hidden alleys, and interconnected social networks functioned unintentionally as facilitators of predation, shaping opportunity, concealment, and control. Geography, combined with social marginalization, amplified the predator's influence while simultaneously obscuring patterns from law enforcement, allowing his methodical approach to remain hidden for years. The timeline also exposes unexpected twists and anomalies. Some potential victims escaped encounters entirely, leaving only partial sketches or fleeting impressions. These deviations complicate retrospective understanding, creating enduring ambiguity and highlighting the predator's adaptability. Such interruptions suggest a keen awareness of risk and an ability to adjust behavior in response to environmental cues. The offender's psychological complexity, combined with investigative gaps, underscores the fragility of detection and the profound role of social context in shaping both victim and perpetrator behavior. Ultimately, the timeline reveals a lattice of observation, assessment, and execution. From initial engagement to disappearance, each step was guided by cognition, situational awareness, and compulsive adherence to ritual. Violence, observation, and ritual interweave to form a deliberate, chilling pattern, demonstrating the interplay of opportunity, psychological compulsion, and social vulnerability. Within this structure, the Doodler's methodical predation illuminates the fragile dynamics of trust, exposure, and concealment in marginalized communities. The investigation into the Doodler murders faced profound structural, social, and cultural challenges that significantly impeded progress. Law enforcement in 1970s San Francisco operated within a landscape constrained by limited resources, incomplete forensic methods, and deeply ingrained societal prejudice toward the LGBT community. While officers documented the series of disappearances, they often hesitated to pursue leads with urgency, constrained by procedural norms and prevailing assumptions regarding the victims' lifestyles. These blind spots allowed patterns to remain partially obscured, leaving critical connections unrecognized, and contributing to a sense of persistent ambiguity surrounding the crimes. Each missed opportunity reinforced the predator's ability to operate undetected, highlighting how institutional frameworks can unintentionally facilitate predation when oversight is incomplete or biased. Detectives pursued multiple investigative avenues, attempting to interview acquaintances, bar patrons, and others linked to the city's nightlife. Yet witness reports were often fragmented, sometimes contradictory, and heavily influenced by social stigma or fear of reprisal. Many victims' friends and partners were wary of engaging with authorities, concerned that contact with police might result in personal exposure or discrimination. This atmosphere of caution, while socially protective, created significant barriers for law enforcement. Silence, fear, and distrust interwove to form an environment in which the offender could maintain access and mobility within the community, operating with near-total invisibility despite a persistent threat. Handling of evidence reflected these broader systemic limitations. Sketches, anecdotal accounts, and personal observations were collected but rarely documented with forensic rigor. Material that might have illuminated patterns or contributed to a behavioral profile was frequently overlooked, misplaced, or disregarded. Retrospective analysis suggests that these procedural lapses, when combined with societal bias against marginalized victims, severely hindered the identification and apprehension of the offender. The structural weaknesses within law enforcement operations emphasize the critical importance of procedural consistency, cultural awareness, and forensic precision in addressing serial predation. The media's role in shaping public perception was ambivalent and at times contradictory. Coverage oscillated between sensationalism and discretion, reflecting both public curiosity and societal discomfort with crimes affecting a marginalized population. Newspapers, although initially limited in their reporting, amplified fear through selective focus on intrigue rather than investigative clarity. Headlines emphasized mystery and shock, presenting the offenses as simultaneously incomprehensible and terrifying. Within the community, these narratives fostered collective anxiety, blending fact and rumor into a pervasive climate of uncertainty. The resulting media frenzy not only magnified the psychological impact of the crimes, but also complicated the community's understanding of risk, often obscuring actionable insight in favor of dramatized intrigue. Public reaction was shaped by fear, stigma, and a desire for self-preservation. Social spaces, particularly bars and clubs frequented by the LGBT population, implemented informal safety measures designed to mitigate risk while avoiding direct confrontation with the threat. Individuals altered routines, emphasized discretion, and adjusted social behaviors in subtle ways, reinforcing the predator's leverage by creating an environment in which fear itself regulated behavior. This adaptive response, while practical, inadvertently played into the offender's strategy. He operated in a space where social anxiety, self-monitoring, and community discretion created psychological dominance, allowing him to maintain control without physical enforcement. Within the investigative framework, hypotheses about motive varied widely. Police speculated that the offenses could be expressions of personal vendettas, internalized self-loathing, or thrill-seeking behavior. The organized, methodical nature of the crime suggested a calculated and controlled offender rather than an impulsive actor. However, ambiguity surrounding the killer's motives complicated profiling efforts. Analysts considered multiple psychological dimensions, including obsession, power, and the displacement of unresolved internal conflict onto victims. Each theory, while plausible, underscored the complexity of understanding crime that operates at the intersection of cognition, environment, and social invisibility. Community leaders, advocates, and informal networks sought to fill the gaps left by law enforcement. Precautionary practices, peer communication, and shared advisories became essential tools for collective survival. Bars and social spaces reinforced informal safety protocols, emphasizing mutual vigilance while maintaining discretion. These adaptive social structures illustrate how cohesion and community awareness can mitigate risk, yet simultaneously highlight systemic failures within official institutions. The interplay between the predator's strategy and the community's self-regulation demonstrates how environmental and social factors contribute to the feasibility of predation, revealing that crimes are often enabled as much by structural and cultural conditions as by individual pathology. Criticism of law enforcement emerged both during and after the investigation, centering on perceived inaction, procedural inconsistency, and methodological shortcomings. Decisions about resource allocation, prioritization, and evidence assessment were shaped by societal norms that marginalized victims, amplifying the broader psychological consequences of systemic bias. When institutions fail to respond equitably, fear intensifies within affected communities, and offenders can exploit predictable patterns of inattention or neglect to operate undisturbed. Retrospective analysis suggests that greater cultural competence, rigorous procedural standards, and proactive collaboration with community networks might have significantly altered the course of the investigation, offering enduring lessons for contemporary policing in marginalized contexts. Despite these challenges, the investigation provided critical insight into serial predation. Analysts emphasized the relevance of pre-offense behavior, ritualized actions, and subtle psychological markers in developing offender profiles. Retrospective study also highlights the importance of community-informed policing, thorough documentation, and awareness of social and cultural dynamics in assessing criminal patterns. The psychological weight of public reaction further underscores the case's impact. Collective trauma amplified by fear, silence, and ambiguity altered daily behaviors, reinforced social invisibility, and allowed the predator to exploit these adaptations as indirect mechanisms of control, affecting the emotional and structural fabric of the community itself. Ultimately, this phase of the investigation illuminates a nexus of human, institutional, and cultural dynamics. Law enforcement, constrained by tangible limitations and intangible biases, faced extraordinary difficulty in pursuing justice for a marginalized population. Public reaction, simultaneously protective and anxious, shaped both perception and reality, altering the behavior of potential victims and witnesses. Understanding these intersecting forces is essential to grasping the broader implications of serial predation, demonstrating how crime, fear, and social marginalization coalesce to leave lasting psychological echoes long after the physical acts themselves. In the case of the Doodler, investigation, media, and community responses together form a complex tapestry, revealing that the reach of predation often extends far beyond individual acts, shaping the social and emotional architecture of entire communities. The Doodler's psychological profile emerges from careful, retrospective analysis of behavior, victim selection, and ritualized practice, revealing a mind that was simultaneously structured, methodical, and meticulously controlled. His actions suggest the hallmarks of an organized offender capable of compartmentalizing violent impulses, suppressing internal conflicts, and maintaining an external facade of normalcy. The engagement with victims was characterized by charm, attentiveness, and observation, strategies that leveraged trust and exploited social norms to create a perception of safety. This approach demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of human psychology, as well as an acute awareness of social and environmental variables that could be manipulated to preserve dominance. In essence, his predation was cognitive, orchestrated, and relational, relying on subtle coercion and the careful calibration of risk, rather than impulsive physical aggression. Psychological theories provide insight into potential motivations and underlying dynamics. Trauma-based models suggest that unresolved early experiences, ranging from neglect and rejection to internalized stigma or family dysfunction, can manifest as externalized aggression toward others. Displacement of self-directed frustration, anger, or shame onto victims is a recurrent pattern in serial predation, serving both as a mechanism for perceived control and as a means of regulating emotional tension. For the Doodler, the act of sketching may have functioned as a cognitive buffer, a ritualized intermediary that allowed him to maintain symbolic distance between observation and execution, fantasy and reality, thought and action. Each sketch was more than documentation. It represented the negotiation between desire, control, and psychological restraint, allowing him to enact power without immediate corporeal confrontation. The interplay between self-concept and social perception is essential to understanding the Doodler's behavior, revealing how internal conflicts can manifest externally in calculated predation. The offender likely experienced profound cognitive dissonance, caught between a desire for social acceptance and an internalized hostility toward marginalized identity, either his own or that which he perceived in others. This tension created a psychological landscape in which impulses, shame, and suppressed desire coexisted with the need to maintain outward composure. Philosophical perspectives, particularly Stoic reflections on control, acceptance, and the limits of external influence, illuminate how internal drives are negotiated against environmental and social constraints. In the Doodler's case, his exertion of control over circumstances, spatial environment, and interpersonal interactions represents an extreme pathological expression of this tension. Each act of manipulation, observation, and engagement with victims reflects a systematic translation of internal conflict into structured, deliberate behavioral patterns, revealing a mind that externalizes internal struggle through meticulous control and predatory strategy. From the standpoint of trauma psychology, victims' invisibility and marginalization amplified their risk and deepened the psychological impact of the offenses. Chronic stress, the necessity of concealment, and societal stigma create vulnerabilities that predators can exploit, whether through physical isolation, emotional manipulation, or calculated persuasion. The Doodler's selection of victims appears to have been influenced both by opportunity and symbolic resonance, targeting individuals whose social circumstances limited resistance and heightened susceptibility to coercive control. In doing so, he exploited the structural invisibility imposed by society itself, turning marginalization into a mechanism of predation. The aftermath of the case illustrates enduring uncertainty and the persistence of psychological echoes. Decades later, the identities of all victims, the full scope of offenses, and the motivations of the offender remain partially obscured. Investigative gaps, incomplete records, and social silences leave the narrative fragmented. The community continues to reconcile collective memory with unresolved trauma, and the absence of closure reinforces psychological and social patterns, caution, hypervigilance, and intergenerational awareness of risk. Fear, memory, and silence become intertwined, sustaining both knowledge and apprehension, and shaping perceptions of trust and safety within marginalized populations. Modern approaches to cold case analysis provide potential avenues for renewed investigation. Digital archival work, forensic advancements, and behavioral modeling may uncover previously inaccessible patterns, while integrating historical context and community knowledge allows for a richer understanding of social and environmental variables. However, the inherent ambiguity of past interactions, sketches, fleeting observations, and undocumented encounters ensures that certainty remains elusive. The open-ended nature of the case exemplifies the tension between the known and the unknown, fact and inference, and highlights the methodological limitations of reconstructing criminal psychology from incomplete data. Philosophically, the case encourages deep reflection on the tension between concealment and revelation that resides at the core of human behavior. The Doodler's actions illustrate a striking paradox. Visibility through the permanence of artistic representation, invisibility through the execution of violent acts that evade public recognition. Victims' presence is immortalized in sketches and memory, yet the offender's identity remains only partially apprehended, resisting full societal understanding. This duality engages both ethical and psychological inquiry, highlighting the compartmentalization of harm and the selective disclosure of truth that allows the mind to observe, manipulate, and conceal simultaneously. It also underscores the ways in which crime is not confined to physical space alone, but unfolds within social perception and cognitive architecture. By examining these dynamics, the case illuminates moral and existential dimensions of predation, demonstrating how human awareness, societal structures, and internal psychology converge to shape both vulnerability and control. Considering future implications, the Doodler's crimes serve as a case study in predator-victim dynamics, the influence of social marginalization, and the necessity of integrative investigative approaches. They underscore the importance of combining behavioral science, cultural understanding, and forensic methodology to anticipate, prevent, and interpret predatory behavior. At the same time, the case reinforces enduring truths. Human behavior is complex, motivations are multifaceted, and unresolved trauma continues to shape both individual and collective consciousness, leaving long-term psychological and societal consequences. Ultimately, the case confronts a question that remains partly unanswerable. Why did he do it? The answer may reside in fragmented psychology, compounded social marginalization, and the interplay of control, observation, and fantasy. Empirical certainty may be unattainable, yet careful analysis illuminates the psychological architecture of predation, fear, and secrecy, offering insights into both historical and contemporary patterns of serial offending. The Doodler's shadow lingers, a silent reminder of the fragility of social trust, the complexity of human psychology, and the chilling consequences of unresolved trauma, marginalization, and deliberate concealment. The Doodler's crimes remind us that fear often reflects our own hidden vulnerabilities. Silence, stigma, and social marginalization intersected with a predator's meticulous planning to produce enduring psychological terror, shaping both community behavior and collective memory. Reflecting on these events challenges us to confront not only the acts of violence themselves, but also the societal conditions that enabled them to persist unchecked. Marginalization, secrecy, and procedural blind spots illustrate how environments can be manipulated to facilitate harm. Awareness, empathy, and structural vigilance remain essential to preventing repetition, ensuring that lessons of the past inform both policy and community practices. As we leave these shadows behind, remember to like, share, and subscribe for further explorations into the complexities of human behavior. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences resonate louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.
References 1. Newton, M. 2000. The Encyclopedia of Serial Killers. New York, Facts on File. 2. Schechter, H., and Everett, D. 2006. The AZ Encyclopedia of Serial Killers. Simon & Schuster. 3. Vronsky, P. 2004. Serial Killers, The Method and Madness of Monsters. New York, Berkeley Books.